Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI said that, quote, when the intellectual history of the Catholic Church in the 20th century is written, the name of Dietrich von Hildebrand will be most prominent among the figures of our time. Tonight, we'll discuss how one of Europe's most outspoken voices against Nazism and communism can enlighten the church and the world today. So please stay with us. Thank you very much. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from around the world. Before we get to our guests, I want to mention that today is the feast of Saint Stephen of Hungary. He was born in 975 AD, and at age 25, in the year 1000, he became the king of Hungary and was king for about 38 years. He is very well known because he was very committed to the spread of the church in his realm, as well as to making sure that justice was done to everybody, the poor as well as to the wealthy and the powerful. And for that, he was canonized in 1083 by Pope St. Gregory VII. All right, today we have a guest who is the leader of an innovative group of individuals dedicated to connecting the religious, political, and philosophical wisdom of a 20th century philosopher named Dietrich von Hildebrand. He was for the church and the world today, and he offered fresh insights into questions about the nature of love, Christian faith and practice, as well as the transformative power of beauty, something we need a lot of. So please welcome the founder of the Hildebrand Project, Mr. John Henry Crosby.
Thank you, Father.
Henry,
good to be here.
Good to have you.
It's good to be back.
Good to have you indeed. Some of our viewers may not remember, but you've been working on this project for Dietrich von Hildebrand and his writings for some time, and you've been working with his wife.
That's right.
Who's still alive,
and well.
A good friend of the network. We haven't seen her in a while, but that's Alice von Hildebrand. First of all, before we get to your business, how is she doing?
She's doing very well. She's 94 years old.
Yeah.
She is as sharp as ever. She
Yes.
Produces at a rate that I, as a relatively young man, wish I could. She still churns out an article about every second week, which she publishes.
Good.
And she's very happy I'm here, and her message to all of the viewers is just one of affection and love and gratitude for all the years that she was able to address them on the network. She was, of course, a great friend of Mother's.
Exactly. She was very, very close to Mother Angelica. She's been a guest on Mother's program a number of times.
That's right.
And she also was a guest on the show when I've been hosting it. So it's, you know, we miss her. I hope that she continues to do well. I wouldn't call it exactly retirement.
No, there's nothing retiring about
Yeah.
Alice von Hildebrand. And I heard from Doug Keck today that she recorded an interview with him not too long ago in New York. So she went into the studio, and there's more forthcoming from Alice von Hildebrand.
Absolutely. Well, good. But one of the things that's been very important for her is helping the world to understand the work of her husband. She had married him when he was already somewhat older than she, a number of years older.
That's right.
I believe she married him after World War II
That's
was
right,
over.
yeah. 1959.
Yes, yeah, well after the World War. He was a widower himself. And she really sees part of her mission, and she's a thinker and a philosopher in her own right, to be sure, but she also wants to promote his writings. You are working with her, and are you doing some of the translations?
I am, yes. So the Hildebrand Project, which is now in its 14th year, I think 14th year, or going into its 14th year, began as a translation project, but it had a more humble beginning in that I approached her and I said, you know, I think I'd be interested in translating a work. German is my mother tongue, and she had spoken to me about how much she wanted this done, and so she said, fine, and she gave me 10 names of people to contact to raise some support, and the first person who called me back said, I'll give you money to start this, but you need to create some kind of a small organization that would outlive you if you don't continue.
Yes.
And so in 2004, we created the Hildebrand Project, and then we began putting together an advisory council. And I was very young. I have some gray hairs now. I didn't have those at the time.
Well, you're married and you've got kids
But
now.
I wouldn't blame them for that.
Well, yeah, that's it.
No, I'd more be faster to lay that at the feet of my dear Alice von Hildebrand. She makes me work. But in any case, we started inviting people, and one of the very eminent people we invited was a certain Pope Benedict. Actually, a certain Cardinal Ratzinger, not yet Pope Benedict. And after a letter exchange, he agreed to join our advisory council, and we realized more or less at that moment, this is not a one-book translate. This is not a one-trick pony. This is a real organization to get the whole work of her husband translated. So we've been doing that ever since, and then the project has grown. It's grown into putting on seminars for students and professors and clergy and seminarians to get them acquainted with the work. So it's it began as a translation project. It's now really an intellectual enterprise.
And it's good for folks to know that you grew up as something of an expatriate. Your parents, your father, I believe, was teaching in Liechtenstein.
That's right. My mother's Austrian, so I grew up speaking German as my native tongue. My parents met, and my dad's American, but when they met and married, they spoke German in the household. So the first group of us kids spoke German, and so I had this this significant advantage, you might say. And then also my parents were friends of von Hildebrand. My father was one of his last American students. And my mother, being Austrian, knew him already there. So in a way, and in fact, von Hildebrand even played a role in my parents getting married. To each other. Yes, he sort of suggested it to my mother and urged my dad. And so I'm also kind of personally grateful.
Yeah, I should say so.
To him.
Say so. And this is some of the background. Now, I think it's important. We've been having a lot of tension in this country, and it's a tension that is fueled by ideologies and politics of different kinds. Dietrich von Hildebrand was a philosopher who got into the fray of reflecting on very dangerous times of European history. He was born when?
Born 1889.
89.
Yeah.
And so he'd be almost 120 years.
Yeah. Oh, he'd be quite elderly. Yeah. But he was a young man when these ideologies swept through Europe.
And among the ideologies that were going through Europe when he was a young man were communism.
Of course.
Karl Marx had been publishing, and I think he was still alive when he was born.
That could be. I'm
think
not
so.
going to try to claim to know that date offhand.
And then, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was in 1917. And then he also was living in Germany when Adolf Hitler began the Nazi movement.
That's right.
So these extremely vicious and dangerous movements were coming up. What was his reaction to them?
Right. And seductive movements, we should add. Seductive for so many people. Well, von Hildebrand, during the First World War, thought that it was a war of aggressive nationalism between the countries, and so he exercised his right of conscience and did hospital service, worked in the Red Cross.
Right.
And he simply thought it was a war without a justification for fighting as a Christian. He didn't share that. He didn't view it as a way of being a German patriot, as many others did.
Yeah, and so folks understand, you know, Christian theory of a just war requires that you can defend your country when it is attacked. But Germany had not been attacked.
That's right.
That wasn't the case. It was more earlier in 1870, Germany had been constituted as an empire with a Kaiser in charge, and they wanted more power in Europe and to unify all the German people.
That's right.
So, and there were other empires, England, France, Austria-Hungary, all these empires in Russia, they're all clashing with each other. He didn't think that was a just reason for war.
That's right. That's right. And so then we come into the 1920s, which is a moment when very few people think about Nazism. But I think one can say that Dietrich von Hildebrand was the first man of stature to raise his voice against National Socialism, Nazism, at the earliest possible moment. 1921, he went to a conference in Paris, a peace conference, and he made statements against German nationalism. And that put him on the radar of this very early stage Nazi party. And when he came back, he had been accused of betraying his loyalty to Germany as being a national traitor. And it created what we would today call a kind of media firestorm. But the Nazis in particular blacklisted him, and in fact, 2 years later, when Hitler first attempted to seize power in this so-called Beer Hall Putsch, 1923, which failed, von Hildebrand had to flee for his life because he had found out that his name was on the list of political opponents that the Nazis wanted to wipe out right away at the very beginning. And I think it's very significant for von Hildebrand's, what we can learn from him today, that he didn't primarily oppose Nazism as a political movement. He opposed it primarily because of political preferences or political points of difference, parties and so on, right? He opposed it at a level of first principles. He saw that Nazism was built out of a kind of portfolio of these basic evils: racism and anti-Semitism, nationalism, materialism, the whole anti-Christian spirit of National Socialism. That's what he directed his energy against.
Yeah, see, that's something that's very important. You know, it's one thing if you say, well, look, I don't like the Nazis because my political party should be in charge.
Right, right.
That's not his approach.
That's right.
Nor should it be the approach of any Catholic.
That's exactly right.
We must examine policies on the basis of Christian principles.
That's right.
This is the key. And that's what he opposed with Hitler.
That's right. In fact, he had many of his allies in the fight against Nazism. It turned out, as he worked with them, did not like Hitler because of these party. They didn't want the Nazi party. They had another party that they would have preferred, but they were very soft, say, on anti-Semitism. So they didn't even disagree with Hitler on everything. They just didn't want his party to be in power for various reasons. And he ran into that consistently. And that was very discouraging for him because it made him realize that what appeared to be a united front of resistance was often really not. There was not a deep foundation for the resistance, and certainly, and even among Catholics, it was quite common that there was a sort of a weak resistance based more on politics than principle.
And von Hildebrand, what was his attitude towards the anti-Semitism of the Nazis and the light?
That's right.
Anti-Semitism of other people. Yeah. What was his mentality on that?
Well, I mean, it's one of his achievements again that where many people were certainly later on became opposed to Nazi racism. They would have been opposed to a death camp. They tolerated and themselves promoted a certain amount of kind of sort of low-key anti-Semitism. You know, the anti-Semitism where you would say disparaging things about Jews, or you would not want a Jew to marry your daughter, or such a kind of soft anti-Semitism. Don't kill them, but just push them to the margins. And von Hildebrand thought that was just as he didn't think it was as evil as killing Jews, but he thought it was as foundationally corrupt. And he thought that any political party that subscribed to that or that exploited that in the culture. It was a kind of culture-wide phenomenon in German and Austrian, really in European culture, was something to be opposed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a novel that was published called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And people began to take the novel as actual history.
That's right. That's right.
And what was written as an evil novel, blaming Jews for running the banks and all sorts of other things, was then republished without the author and all as a true fact, and that just fired anti-Semitism that was completely false.
That's right. Absolutely. There was the narrative regarding Jews as really the object of the source of everything bad in culture was so ingrained that a book like this could get traction. It could be taken seriously.
Exactly. Yeah. It's in one sense not completely unlike the Da Vinci Code.
That's right.
That said all these terrible things about the Catholic Church. Well, that kind of use of a novel as if it were presenting facts happened earlier against the Jews with horrendous results.
That's right. No, and von Hildebrand had to direct himself against all of this in his work, and he did it with a great deal of personal concern. One should emphasize that he didn't primarily as a philosopher, he was of course focused on truth, and he wanted to combat untruth and evil, but inasmuch as these untruths were often held by friends and members of his own family, he proceeded with a great deal of passion and mercy and the desire to sort of dissuade them of their confusion. So it was not done. It was done in a way that was merciful and effective in some cases. So I think he's also a model for how one goes about this. You have these difficult truths to announce. Yeah, you have to speak truth unflinchingly, but you have to do it also in such a way that you can gain the hearing and the trust and sympathy of your friends and family. So he was a model of that as well.
One of the other points that's worth for our viewers to note is that von Hildebrand was critiquing the Nazis in 1921.
Right.
2 years before they even started their little revolution that failed.
Right, the beer hall putsch.
Yeah, and Hitler ended up in prison for that, did he not?
He ended up in prison, and it's where he wrote Mein Kampf, unfortunately.
See, that's one of the things. He had not even written
That's right.
anything like Mein Kampf, his main book laying out his relativism and his ideas of anti-Semitism and all these other plans. That was not even written down. And von Hildebrand had already begun criticizing and continued after that was written.
There's a wonderful line that one of his students said of him, that he said he had a kind of barometer for what was brewing in the atmosphere. Not in the sense of climate, but in the sense of the ideas and the values that were floating around and beginning to captivate people. And he had a sixth sense for that. And then the student goes on to say that his great strength as a teacher was that he could immunize us as his students so that we were no longer susceptible to the siren song of all of these ideologies.
When he say that he immunized against these ideas, how would he do that?
Well, it was a combination of representing and defending core Christian truths. It was a way, I think, of being persuasive about them. He didn't just sort of state them, but as a philosopher, he was always making the case for these things. He says in later years he would go on to found an anti-Nazi newspaper. Maybe we'll get to that. It became the leading publication of the anti-Nazi resistance in Vienna, where Hildebrand would go. And he says in the mission statement of that, the mission of this publication is to repropose all of the great concepts of the Christian West, the idea of truth and justice and freedom, because all of these ideas have become misunderstood and are being affected by competing versions that are preventing Christians from holding their own teaching and tradition.
I think this is a very important element of what's going on. When he criticized nationalism, this cannot be emphasized enough, because what nationalism does is put the nation, the race, the people, or so usually along those lines, ahead of all other values.
Right, and all other human communities, the family, the individual.
And it's ahead of God, and it's ahead of the church. And this began with the French Revolution and putting the state ahead of the church and God. And that's one of the reasons that Christian ideas were pushed under. You don't realize the state has superseded the church. It's greater than the church. It's greater than God. We create our own values. That's what he was attacking.
That's right. That's right. He was also very good at understanding why people would be susceptible to some of these, for example, the ideas of Nazism. So regarding the whole Nazi idea of the German community, he realized that it was really a false substitute for real community, but it played on a deep need for community. There was a sense of isolation in the culture. He speaks of the legacy of liberal individualism, meaning a kind of vision of the person cut off from other people and from God. So people wanted to fill that cavernous hole inside of themselves. But he pointed out to them that only that Nazism can't offer this sense of community that people are looking for. It will come from the family, it will come from the church, it will come from other types of communities that human beings form. And then the other thing that he was very good on was the difference between, he could always point to what the real thing, the legitimate value was in the untruth. So with nationalism, he would say nationalism asserted my country over and against all other countries in a hostile way that made it impossible, say, for a German to value the French or the English. He thought that patriotism, by which he meant a love of one's nation, was in fact open to the contributions and the goods of other countries. In other words, to be patriotic, a patriotic German meant that one could value the great culture of France or of Italy or of England. And so he would say that nationalism was a kind of egocentrism at the level of nation, where you would sort of assert your country with pride and arrogance, whereas patriotism was love of your country and enough humility to recognize the good that other countries offered. So with regard to Europe, he always spoke of the family of nations. He thought that these countries in a patriotic way, as opposed to a nationalistic way, could come together in some kind of harmony and unity. That's what he called it. That was the whole idea of the supranational. So it wasn't sort of the modern international idea. It wasn't the United Nations. It was something deeper and closer, where these nations would build common cause out of real shared values, above all the Christian faith, which of course is no longer the binding fabric of Europe as it would have been.
See, this is something that I think is a temptation in modern America, in that we'll have folks who say, look, we've got separation of church and state, which is based on a decision by the Supreme Court in 1947. It's not in the Constitution. And since there's separation of church and state, if the state makes a law, the church just has to accept it. If the state says abortion is okay, marriage is redefined, or certain races, like in this country, African Americans, are to be put down. Slavery is the law of the land, at one time anyway. Then that supersedes the church's rejection of slavery, abortion, and changing marriage. And therefore the church has nothing to say. That's the modern temptation now, that the church is being told there's a separation of church and state. You cannot criticize what we're doing. That's not that different than what was going on back in the last couple centuries in Europe.
Well, you know, it's a big issue that you raise, and I think that von Hildebrand would, at the very least, he would have said, and he often said in his anti-Nazi papers, that the church, meaning the leadership of the church, the bishops, had an obligation to speak much earlier and much more forcefully in condemning National Socialism. He felt that so many ordinary lay people simply would not have sort of taken the step, but when to either joining the party or becoming soft. He spoke often of becoming morally numb, meaning that sort of over time you just lost your sense for the evil, and then eventually you would sort of become swept up in it, because Nazism was the political party, the political environment in which you operated. But von Hildebrand thought that in fact, as a layman, this sets him apart from many other people at the time. He quite openly challenged the bishops in his time to speak more openly. So this is not quite the same thing as the church having, anything like the ability of the state, but it still assumed that the church had a tremendous power over hearts and minds in the culture, and that he felt that that somehow Germany could have been saved from Nazism had Christians spoken truth, and particularly leading Christians, priests, bishops, and so on, spoken openly.
That's I would agree with that. And there's a risk. Some people don't like to speak up in the church because then, they won't listen. I mean, you look at the way the papacy had strongly condemned and put under automatic excommunication from 1435 forward any kind of involvement in the slave trade. If you enslaved people, you were automatically excommunicated, and people didn't listen any more than they listened to the automatic excommunication associated with abortion. They just refused to listen.
That's right.
And some people in the church say, they don't listen, so let's not speak up. We can't be quiet on the social issues. We have to speak up and address them from our pulpits, and the bishops and cardinals and such must speak up on these issues.
Von Hildebrand also recognized that there would be times when a certain kind of person, perhaps a lay person without any particular position of authority, would not be able to speak openly, though there might be a calling on that person to speak, but let's just say a father of a family. But he still insisted that if you lived under an evil regime, that you had to find a way to live in a state of inner resistance. In other words, you couldn't just say, I have no control over this. I just have to kind of accept that this is the law of the land and I can't resist it. No, he thought he has this wonderful image of carrying the dagger of irreconcilable enmity, he calls it, that you carry sort of under the cloak, right? You don't necessarily come out and show your dagger, but inside, in the life of your conscience, keep your conscience sharp by always being prepared. So what that would mean is that, as say you walk down the street and you encountered someone saying something derogatory of a Jew, maybe you couldn't take action, but his idea was that internally you had to take a stance towards that, so that you would always be morally alive and not get swept up in this and become soft.
Exactly. See, that's one of the things that is very important about standing up against the evils, no matter what. Now, he didn't find life go easily for him when he opposed Nazis. He had to leave Germany in the 1920s, in 23, right?
33.
33.
Yeah. So he left for the beer hall putsch, but then Hitler went to jail and the Nazi movement sort of went into decline for a time. And Hildebrand was able to continue his teaching at the University of Munich, but he lived in Bavaria, and so he had a kind of front row seat for the rising Nazi party. And it became quickly evident in the late 20s that this was going to be a force to be reckoned with, and that the church would have to rally itself into resistance. And then Hitler comes to power in 1933, and von Hildebrand is presented with a decision. The decision is, do I stay or do I go? Do I stay in Germany or do I leave? It was really the question might have been even more radically, can I stay? Because he thought, as a Catholic, I can't betray my faith. And as a philosopher, I have an obligation to speak truth publicly. I can't just sort of consider this something I do in my classroom. And so he thought he would compromise himself if he stayed and didn't speak, whereas maybe someone else didn't have that same public vocation. So he decided to leave Germany, and though we know where he went, he ended up in Vienna and he started this tremendous journal, he had no idea what was next. He just threw himself into the providential arms of God. It's all I really can say. But what's so striking about that was that at these worst moments in his life, when everything was taken away, he was giving up his career and this beautiful home in Munich that he had inherited from his father, he, at those very moments, seemed to have the greatest peace. He felt, he would quote Abraham, God will provide. And so it was a kind of leitmotif throughout his life, this sense of providential protection, particularly in the worst moments. And that happened again when he was in Vienna. He was once warned that an assassination plot had been mounted against him and others. And the policeman was sort of ironic. He said, it would be embarrassing for me to have an assassination in my precinct, meaning don't get killed, and Hildebrand said, it would be embarrassing for me too.
Yeah.
So he had that kind of sense of humor, and he says in his memoirs, he says, even at that moment, he said, certainly his words made an impression on me, but I can't say that in any way they changed my resolve and my sense of peace that I was doing what God would, because I knew I was doing what God was asking of me, I was not afraid. He says that's his, I was always so taken by the, I'm not afraid, even though he lives in fear. In fact, his wife, his first wife, was very afraid, and she was very sweet. She insisted on accompanying him everywhere, as if she could have prevented an assassination attempt. Yeah. But nevertheless, she wanted to be there and to sort of shield him in the event that anything happened. And I think I told you earlier today when we were chatting that his wife, though she wasn't a philosopher the way Alice was, his wife was incredibly loyal and committed to his anti-Nazism. She also gave up everything. She gave up the home and the community and the family and lived in total uncertainty. They arrived as paupers in the United States in 1940.
Yeah, eventually they had to come to the United States. All right. We have to take a break. It's interesting that we could go on talking about this, but we'll take a break now, and we'll come back with your questions and your comments, as well as those of our studio audience. So please stay with us. Thank you, and welcome back. You know, we've been talking about Dietrich von Hildebrand and his book, My Battle Against Hitler, and 3 other books from the new publishing arm of the Hildebrand Project. It's called Hildebrand Press. It's very good. You know, a lot of philosophers are really, really boring to read, but this book on, on Hitler, about von Hildebrand versus Hitler is very readable. It's a wonderful book, and I urge you to get that, plus some of his other books. Are you ready for some questions?
Sure.
All right. Let's start off with Victor in Connecticut. Victor?
Hi, Father Mitch. Nice to speak with you.
Nice to speak with you. What's your question?
I have a question for Mr. Crosby. It seems like in this country, in the United States, there seems to be a movement, a socialist, atheistic socialist movement, and I was wondering if a lot of of this philosophy is taken from the communists and the Nazis of the past. That's my question.
Victor, great question. So, is some of the atheism that we see going on derived from Nazism, which is National Socialism, and communism, a Marxist type of socialism? What's the relationship of contemporary atheism and this other atheism?
Yeah. Well, I'm asking myself also in light of what von Hildebrand was confronting, because he had a lot to say about atheism in National Socialism. Maybe the first point I would make is that he pointed out that communism and National Socialism were the first political regimes in all of history to make atheism a specific part of their platform. Mm-hmm. The state replaces the church, and it replaces and the Führer in the German context replaces and the nation as a whole replaces the idea of God. And so that's a very significant point, because you can imagine the difference between an atheism, which is the result of philosophers who are promoting it, versus an atheism that becomes state-sponsored and goes on the attack mode against the church.
Yes.
I mean, regarding the contemporary atheism, and the roots of that in specifically Nazism and communism. I don't know whether it's in Nazism and communism as such, but it's in some of their, it's in many of their common sources, right? It would be for example, in the materialism, in which there is no appeal to a higher being. I mean, materialism is at the very heart of these two ideologies. So I would be reluctant, to say this is the primary source of contemporary atheism. I think there are other sources of that. Certainly, the desire to live without God and to live by the light of mankind and his own ingenuity alone, which lies behind so much atheism, is something that is a common thread between any kind of atheism, whether it's early 20th century atheism or contemporary atheism.
I think another link is that Karl Marx and the French revolutionaries, also in the the Paris Commune of 1871, you see that they treated the church on a materialistic level, as you said, but they also saw the church merely as a political entity, and that they feared the church as a political entity that could oppose them. This was something that Karl Marx, in his dissertation on Hegel from the 1840s, came up with that famous line that religion is the opiate of the people.
Right.
Though I would say today, in modern atheism, as they continue to promote drug use, and especially marijuana, legalizing it, but other drugs too, now we would say that opiates are the opiate of the atheists. That they've opted for opiates of different kinds. But I digress.
It's an intriguing point, nevertheless.
Yes, so I think it's an important one, because people need beauty and ecstasy, and atheism cannot provide it. Atheistic art is ugly. Communist art was ugly. Nazi art was ugly and pornographic. It's the church that brings out beauty, and the faith evokes beauty. Michelangelo, Donatello, and so on. So this is a very important element, that they saw the church as the primary threat.
Right.
Lenin saw that. Stalin really saw that, and they attacked it. And we see that kind of ongoing attack that is funded by people. Some very wealthy people are funding the new atheism to attack the church. You have people funding pseudo-Catholic groups like Catholics for Free Choice. This is funded by billionaires in order to undercut the church, and because they see it as a political power. That's one of the things going on.
Yeah, the church and the state in this vision fight over the same real estate. In the life of the person, and so they become opponents. I would point out, though, that with the Nazis, their atheism was not necessarily linked. They did not neglect to see that human beings still need something like religion. So, for example, if you think of the liturgical quality to their pageantry, and there's so much of sort of, you might say, so much religiosity that creeps back in. I mean, you have a kind of priesthood, and then you have this leading figure in the form of the Führer. So, and in some sense,
an appeal to the Teutonic gods, the gods of ancient Germany, and Roman imagery.
That's right. So it may have been ugly and sort of kitsch and so on. And von Hildebrand hated the way in which he thought the Nazis abused German culture, because they often put on sort of quote unquote beautiful things. They admired much of their own history, but he thought that it was a total betrayal of that history because it was used for all of these other purposes.
Right. Let's take a question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
I'm from Hereford, Texas.
Good to have you. I bet you I know what kind of cattle they raise out there. So what's your question?
I was wondering how big a project this was and where are you at in the project?
Okay. It's well, I'll answer it to you like this, that the first time I was on this show, perhaps with you, with Alice von Hildebrand, she was sort of introducing me to the EWTN audience, and she described how I'd come to her, and she said, and this is the young man who has devoted the rest of his life to promoting my husband's legacy. So it's big enough to consume a lifetime or many lifetimes, but in the meantime, the project has grown to include many, many other people and other collaborators. There are other students of von Hildebrand. There's Alice herself. So it's a shared labor, and it's a very happy labor. But in terms of the work, I mean, there are thousands and thousands of pages that are untranslated from German. Hildebrand's memoir, which is the basis of this My Battle Against Hitler book, is 5,000 pages long. Most of it not even typed. It's just in a handwritten form. The published works, you know, depending on how you count them, you know, there's another. You know, there's 6 reprints of English works and 5 or 6 publications of translations, all of them in various stages of development. So they'll all be out, you know, in the next, I'd say, 3 to 5 years. But then in a way the work just begins, because when you finally have these books out, they have to be presented, they have to be explored, they have to be taught. So you might say that's just the foundational first step, and we see ourselves as doing all of that. So in every summer we gather what I like to call the Olympic Village of Christian personalism, meaning we bring together what we think are the best and the brightest, the future of this tradition of von Hildebrand and others like him, like John Paul II, St. Edith Stein, these sort of fellow travelers in the intellectual and spiritual life. And we try to create a destination in which the world's leading scholars and some of the sort of bright lights among students and future priests and future seminarians can gather and sort of take this work into their formation. And then, of course, the idea is that they, as future teachers, for example, will continue to introduce these Hildebrandian ideas. So, I mean, when I think of a young professor who then has a 40-year teaching career, I mean, think of the hundreds and thousands of young people they'll touch in their teaching, and so to be able to equip them with some of their core materials is our goal.
And of course, as we mentioned at the beginning of this part of the show, you have your own publishing house. You are doing your own publishing of the books, and the one on the book against Hitler is very nicely published. You know,
I should give credit. That is a Random House publication.
Okay, that's a Random House.
So we have published both with other publishers and with our own press. The idea is that it's a both and rather than an either or. There are moments. The Random House book idea was that, and I want to credit my friends at Image Books at Random House for a beautiful publication. Yes, is that we wanted to introduce von Hildebrand sort of deep into the heart of the, I don't want to say secular world, but sort of beyond the Christian world. Here's a Christian philosopher who can be presented in such a way that he can really get a hearing. And we found that many of the reviews, many of the radio interviews that I did when the book first came out were from not from sort of the heart of our Catholic roots, but they came from all sorts of different areas, and we were very happy to introduce them very broadly. So that was why we published with Random House. But the reason we have our own press is to accelerate the publications and to be able to sort of print them in the way that we think is most fitting and suitable for our author.
Sure. And you know, I always like to recommend, as important as big books are, smaller books sell.
I know.
We have another caller. Hello, Alice von Hildebrand.
Yes, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
Thank you very much for discussing my husband's life. Obviously, if I yielded to temptation, I would become a female Demosthenes and talk for hours. But I will master.
We don't have that much time.
Well, you know, number one, what should be mentioned, that from the day he entered the Roman Catholic Church, it became the absolute center of his life. He never missed one single Mass of communion as long as it was physically possible. The second thing that I would like to say, that admirable is, as his political views were, it seems to me that must be mentioned that he wrote a book which to my mind is a Catholic classic that will remain classic, Transformation in Christ. this book has such an enormous influence on my life when I first met him and I heard about it. And I beg and urge the public to get acquainted. Number 3, and this is something which is equally important in a society which is so immoral as ours, is a book that he wrote in 1927 called In Defense of Purity. I believe it is one of the most important things that can be done in education today, that he has discovered the beauty, the solemnity, and the sacrality of this sphere, which belongs to God particularly. Now, I'm going to stop because, otherwise I'll be stealing the show. Thank you.
Well, thank you for calling. We appreciate it. It's nice to hear from you.
She probably stole the show already.
There you go. We have another question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
Hello, Our Lady of the Angels in Sarasota, Florida.
Great. Good to have you here. And
Thank you.
Question?
I'm curious as to his prayer life. Can you tell us about that?
Well, we just heard Alice von Hildebrand mention his book, Transformation in Christ. And this is a work that explores, you might say, the Christian life in full, and prayer and contemplation are at the very heart of that. And maybe I'll answer your question in an anecdotal sort of way. Alice's first encounter with him as a young woman was at an evening given in a home. And he would give these they were like retreat evenings of recollection. And he was giving, each evening was devoted to one chapter of this book, Transformation in Christ. And chapter 1 is called The Readiness to Change. And that's the first thing she ever heard from him, this whole idea that at the heart of the Christian life, there has to be this willingness to be radically transformed. And it isn't a changing that we do of ourselves, it's a changing that we allow Christ to do for us. Mm-hmm. And that made the decisive impression on her. That she had not encountered that kind of Catholicism before, such a radical and lived Catholicism, and that gets to the heart of his prayer life. It was not it was a prayer life premised on the idea that the encounter with God in prayer is transformative, and is the key to the fullness of life.
And certainly he experienced lots of changes in his own life. He had been raised without any religious upbringing.
That's right.
His parents were not Catholic. They weren't religious at all, and they didn't teach him any religion. So this was all quite new to him when he did convert.
Yes, as a convert, he converted in 1914 at Easter with his first wife, and the conversion was the greatest. It was the great and most defining experience of his whole life. The before and after of the life of Dietrich von Hildebrand was his conversion. And he and at that time, though, he realized that his knowledge of the church and its culture was still limited. I mean, he had the good sense as a convert to know that he had a lot to learn. Yeah. And so he poured himself into exploring the church's spiritual tradition, its theology. He would spend days in the library in Munich reading the fathers and doctors of the church, and he published very little. It's very interesting that he didn't immediately write How I Became a Catholic. He didn't publish anything for 7 years of a religious nature. And then he wrote a wonderful essay called The New World of Christendom. And it was his reflection on the way in which grace, which was a reality he hadn't known before he became a Catholic, the way in which grace is a new creation. Yeah. Not separate from this world, but totally irreducible to it. Yeah. And that was the sort of the constant of his life, was the sense of the tangible presence of God through his grace in the world. And you might say that was the object of much of his meditation and his prayer life. And of course, then he was a daily communicant. He prayed the liturgy of prayed the divine office every day. So he lived, as full a prayer life as any lay Catholic could have lived at the time.
Sure. We have a question. Hello, Jeanette.
Hello, Father Pacwa.
Hi, where are you calling from?
From New York.
Okay, great. And your question?
I see a relation between the message of Our Lady of Fatima and the message of Dr. von Hildebrand. Like Our Lady said, if people didn't pray and do penance, the erroneous thoughts will be spreading, and it seems that Dr. von Hildebrand exposed those errors. Don't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That, at Fatima in 1917, the lady said in the October apparition, actually it was in the July apparition of 1917, that Russia would spread her errors and that they need to dedicate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And so, but he was someone who, in his Christian commitment, opposed the spread of those errors. And I think, along that line, just want to mention before we get to our next question, is that next Tuesday is the feast of the coronation of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the popes in the past have recommended that all of us consecrate ourselves to the Blessed Mother, especially on that feast. And given the problems and tensions in our country today, I strongly urge all of us to make that kind of consecration. Say a rosary every day this coming week, and especially prepare ourselves to consecrate ourselves to Our Lady and our Lord. But let's go on to another question. Ma'am, where are you from?
Good evening, Father. I am from Sarasota, Florida.
Great.
And my question is, for young people today who are students of history, what would you say would be a good message or something to take away from your project, and what could they learn?
Thank you. Great question.
It is a great question. Well, I think that one of the main things that can be learned by studying von Hildebrand is the enormous power of ideas as they sweep through the culture and influence others, including people who consider themselves fairly sort of independent in their thinking. And one of the most striking things about von Hildebrand was the independence that he displayed. He was so free from any of the natural inclinations that any German of his time would have had. I mean, we talk about how evil nationalism is, but nationalism was basically a common temptation at the time. And the anti-Semitism was in the air. And here's a man who's sort of totally uninfluenced by that. Mm-hmm. And I think the study of history, certainly the study of his life, demonstrates it ought to reveal how extraordinary that independence is. Mm-hmm. So I think that's there are many, many other things that we can learn, even just the idea that we need to know what our own history is. But looking more specifically to von Hildebrand's life, I think that it's so easy to look back with a certain sort of moral superiority and think, well, this wouldn't have happened to me. I wouldn't have been susceptible to these ideas. But it just takes the life of one person like a von Hildebrand, who's a rare figure, who stands apart from his contemporaries, to show just how unlikely it is that most of us, certainly I don't have a lot of confidence that I would have been, that I would have shared all of his ideas had I not maybe been under his influence and under his guidance.
I think, too, for history students, one of the things going on right now is this tension about ideas and, at times, a rejection of patriotism because too many folks cannot separate that from nationalism.
Yes.
They're afraid that, my country, right or wrong, forgetting about the next part of that line, that when my country is right, keep it right, and when my country is wrong, make it right. That's how the rest of that quote goes. Mm-hmm. And for us to understand our actual history, realizing that the people who made our history were, like ourselves, all sinners. Mm-hmm. A lot of them participated in a wide variety of sins, including slave ownership. Not all, but right. About a third of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were slave owners. We have to recognize the sin and at the same time the virtues and the mixture in them and in us. And I think to be able to give a critique on the basis of beauty, the truth of human dignity, and all that God reveals, that's how we judge history. And that would be something I would urge. The book is called My Battle Against Hitler by Dietrich von Hildebrand, plus the other 3 books from the Hildebrand Project and Hildebrand Press, which include Liturgy and Personality. What Bishop Barron has written something for that. And Aesthetics, Volume 1. And also, at this time, where sensuality rather than beauty is promoted with pornography and such, his book, In Defense of Purity. You can get all these from EWTN's religious catalog, EWTNRC.com, or you can call them, 1-800-854-6316. Thank you very much, John Henry. Great to have you here.
It's been great being here. Thank you.
And may the Lord bless all of you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And again, we need you to keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, because we have a lot of bills, especially in the summertime. So appreciate your help. God bless.